Hey Axis and Allies players, the good captain here. Welcome to my 6th video in my Axis and Allies Classic series. This video is titled Britain's Turn 1 or B1, and like the other strategic videos, I'll be going through what Don's essays say to do first, then I'll reset the board and go through my recommended version of play. You'll notice something different. Yes, this is the original board, and I don't have aircraft on the flight stands. I've got another game going in an actual Axis and Allies Classic game going in the other room right now that's on pause, so this will have to suffice for this video. So we're going to get right into it. It's a pretty short turn because in Don's perfect world, the British Navy doesn't exist. And if it does, really just go consolidate around the American transport to help protect it from the marauding German bomber. The marching order for the British aircraft in Britain is to sink any loose German ships. So, for instance, if the sub survived down in Gibraltar, seems like a good attack, a good piece to destroy with the British bomber. Or if the German ships south of Norway survived, the British aircraft can strafe those up on their way to reinforce Karelia. Before I get too much further, we're going to do the purchasing strategy for Don's essays, which states you're to purchase one industry for 15 of the 30 and save the other 15. And unlike all the other unlike the previous videos, I should say, I am going to be going over the Britain's turn 2 purchasing strategy for Don's essays. It's very important. We're not just saving this for fun. So again, one industry, $15, 15 IPCs saved. That's the only way to do it. To maximize your efficiency. Don's essay states that's the optimal purchasing strategy for turn 1. The industry is going to go on to India, but we'll get more into that later in this video. And we'll also cover why you're saving that 15 towards the end as well. So we went over kind of what to do, things to look out for. Any surviving British fleet should consolidate as far away as possible for the moment. British aircraft should hunt any loose German ships. However, if you're looking at this situation exactly as I have it on the board, generally speaking, you'll move the British aircraft to Karelia. Actually, you don't have to move the bomber, or you can move the bomber. The only thing that's really explicitly stated in Don's essays is the decision or not whether to attack this fleet with that bomber. So if they only have one transport down here, it could be a tantalizing target, right? Because if the bomber gets a hit, the German player should, really, I guess he could select the battleship as the hit and hope that he hits on the return fire, but it should get the transport out of the way, at least for a turn. But in this situation, there's no British submarine and there's 2 transports in a battleship. So again, it's not explicitly stated what you should do. You could try to sink one transport and trade your bomber for one transport just to slow down the conquest of Africa by the Germans. But the strategy for these essays is to just surrender Africa to the Germans. Okay, so we're not going to go ahead with that attack here. In fact, we're not going to go ahead with any attacks anywhere, and we're going to go ahead and jump straight into the non-combat movement. And the non-combat movement strategy for Don's essays is that the British transport in India move to the Suez Canal Sea Zone and pick up both of these infantry here and then bring them back to India. So this doubles the amount of infantry that you have in India, which, as I stated earlier, you're going to be dumping the industry in here and turning this into a bulwark against the Japanese. Okay. Also, the tank will move to Persia. 1, 2. There's nothing really stated about what to do with this infantry here. Again, we're letting the Germans take Africa. Okay, we're letting them have it for now. That's pretty much it for the non-combat move. Yeah, I'll move these fighters here. And just for giggles, we'll leave the bomber where it is. But the bomber really, it can go to Karelia too. Karelia is, I think this is stated in the essays, but it is a nice juncture. From here, you can actually push fighters down into India if this looks pretty secure up here. And then the Indian fighter can actually go down to the Union of South Africa and reinforce it, because this sea zone actually touches this piece of land here, which is very important. Well, yeah, it is. So So just keep that in mind. That's another reason why you want to put your British fighters in Karelia. Now we'll go into the purchasing strategy of why you saved 15. Britain's going to collect 28 in the world of Don's essays here. 28 plus 15 is 43. And on turn 2, this is actually pretty important. 9 times out of 10, well, actually there's a trigger for this, but most of the time these will be your purchases. It'll be an aircraft carrier and a fighter, which wipes out 30 IPCs, and then you're left with the remaining 13. And remember now, you've got this industry in India at this point, right? At the start of Britain's turn 2. What you should use that $13 cash for is probably 2 tanks and an infantry, right? For 13. Because one of the themes here is to attack Japan, or at least be very aggressive against Japanese expansion from India. Again, we're really kind of, as you can see, doubling down on India here as a bulwark against the Japanese in exchange for the surrendering of Africa to the Germans. That's the strategy here. But back to the purchasing strategy. The reason we're using this British carrier, the fighter, for obvious reasons, is to just kind of start funneling it down into the middle of the map here. But the British carrier, and this is very important, again, to go over some small differences in this version of Axis and Allies, you cannot place the British aircraft on the carrier on the turn that you bought it. You cannot do that. In other versions, I think in almost every other version of Axis and Allies, you can, right? If you have an aircraft carrier in the C zone, you can actually even land fighters in your non-combat movement phase. You can actually catch those fighters on the carrier, right? You could have fighters in the C zone awaiting the purchase of the carrier. Not so in this game. Not so in this game. And so the turn 2 purchase, the reason you're doing this is because the British go after the Germans, and then the Americans go before the Germans. So you can do this kind of 1-2 punch. And the 1-2 punch aspect of this is that the British lay down this aircraft carrier, the Japanese take their turn, and for the most part, regardless of what happens, the American player can then land 2 of his fighters on that British aircraft carrier. And what this will do is anchor this sea zone for the Allies. You now have a very strong and safe defense against marauding German aircraft for when you, and we'll get more into this in the US player's turn, but you'll be able to protect the American transports, which will be basically camping out in the UK sea zone, and then shucking between eastern Canada and this sea zone, dumping into France or to Finland. So that's kind of a neat little strategy, and it's crucial in Don's essays that this is the turn 1 and 2 turn British purchasing strategy. There is a situation in which you don't purchase the aircraft carrier, and at least that's what the essays say. I'll get more into this in the American player's turn, because it has to do with how successful the German bomber was at destroying turn 1 builds by the American player. If they destroyed 1 or more transports, he basically says don't build the aircraft carrier. But at any rate, and then in that case, the U.S. should build an aircraft carrier instead. So we'll get more into that in the U.S. player's turn, but I just wanted to kind of cover this. So that really is pretty much it. It does make mention of if this transport survives, they should try to go get the Australians out of Australia and bring them back to India. So the short game is a bulwark against the Japanese, okay? And then in the mid game, you want to assist the Americans in building up their fleet, and then joining them too. You want to start to build up some ships of your own. Of course, this first turn build, your primary responsibility is going to be doing what you can with India. Now the essays state that eventually the Japanese will overwhelm you, but the exchange in the amount of time it takes for the Japanese to take over India is well worth the purchasing of the industry here. The key is to just be aggressive. Use your tanks, build a lot of spam tanks. Basically, is what the essays say to do from India. Spam tanks and attack as much as you can the Japanese player. Even if you're I understand attacking with tanks is not the cost benefit analysis doesn't quite add up. But again, you're exchanging time for that return in income and keeping the Japanese and the Axis overall down in terms of IPC and economy. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and reset the board, and then we're going to go through my recommended version of play. Okay, so we've reset the board here, but before I go into my version of play, I do want to touch up on one more thing. Don's essays say that if the Germans have made a successful first turn bid against Egypt, then most of the time you should be building an industry down in the Union of South Africa instead of India. Okay, instead of India, you're going to basically give that to the Japanese and instead fortify from the Union of South Africa and commit upwards. And it's a very tepid endorsement, that recommendation, but it does state clearly that if the Germans take this, you need to take a very careful look at the strategic situation before plopping an industry into India. But now we've got it in my world here. If I'm playing somebody who's taken over Egypt or not, this is I'll do a quick caveat on what to do if they haven't gone for this, but it's basically the same thing. This is where the little trick with the Russian tanks kind of comes in. My purchasing strategy, before we get into that trick, is this. 2 industries. And I know that seems weird, but if you remember back to my video number 2, you'll know that I'm a big fan of containment as the Allies. And Britain has an advantage and a disadvantage in this game. The disadvantage is that they're spread out and can be attacked virtually everywhere, and they only have 1 industry. And the advantage is they're spread out everywhere. And now you might be wondering, how the hell does that make any sense? And hopefully you've inferred what makes sense by seeing my purchases. Because they're so spread out, they've got some choice territories for which they can place industries. And these are the 2 and 3 IPC value territories. Now, Egypt, which is a 2 IPC territory, if it hasn't been taken, is still a little too close to be putting an industry in. But you've got a few others. You've got Eastern Canada, which is too far away. You've got Australia, India, and Union of South Africa. And where I like to put them is India. Yes, I agree with Don's essays there, and the Union of South Africa. Australia is too much of a prison camp. It's difficult enough getting these 2 guys out of there. Purchasing an industry here commits you to buying naval units, which are expensive in and of themselves, and the logistics of taking back these crummy territories from the Japanese with their huge navy is not realistic. However, with this setup, you're making a very loud statement about containment. Turn 1, boom, 2 industries, all 30 IPCs. Britain's here to slow the Axis down. We're fighting the long-term war by doing this. Oh, in my world, I guess I have Britain still has a battleship and a transport. In my version of things, yeah, there's not going to be any combat, just like for the most part in Don's essays. You could take a risk and try to sink that transport. I'm not a big risk taker like that. If I missed and just lost the bomber for no good reason, I wouldn't like it. So I'm going to go ahead and do the non-combat moves, assuming there's no combat. And for the non-combat moves, we'll pull these industries out for right now. You know where they're going to go. For the non-combat moves, I actually pull the British out of India and consolidate with the unit out of Syria. I'm sorry, not both of them. I leave 1 in India, right? You always want to leave 1. I also pull the fighter back. Of course, this guy will move up 1. That's to prevent a blitz. I send the transport down to Australia. And yes, of course, I move the fighters to Karelia, and the bomber generally goes with it or stays there depending on what's going on. And if there's any British fleet, I consolidate east of the United States for the time being. So, let's go over this real quick. Why did I make these moves? Well, especially why put an industry down if you're just going to pull out? That seems ridiculous. The truth of it is that this is sort of a trap for the Japanese. Let's say we're going to end our turn here, right? We're going to place our builds. The Japanese can take India. Yes, they can commit 2 infantry, 4 infantry if they really want to risk a transport, right? But then they're basically going to lose a transport or have a high probability of losing a transport on their first turn, and the Japanese need their transports. So they could bring up to 4 infantry, but okay, let's say, they see 1 infantry there. This has got an industry. Yes, we want to take that industry down so the British can't use it next turn. Commit a fighter. They could commit a bomber too. They could commit another fighter from up here. Okay, let's say they take it, and let's say there's 2 infantry there, and the aircraft all have to fly away. The Americans go, and let's say that the Japanese have moved their forces in a way that they've covered French Indochina, Burma, and all these areas. So the Americans are kind of strung out. They're not feeling like they can attack. And that's where the Russians come in. So remember that 3 tanks in right here, right? Well, these 3 tanks can counterattack India and take it back relatively easily. If you really feel like it, you can move these fighters down to support. Of course, these fighters will be out of position for a turn. They'll be in Persia, or out of position if you're worried about defending the Eastern Front. But the Russians can actually clean out the Japanese fairly easily. Oh, excuse me. They can have up to 4, right? Because we have a guy in Novosibirsk, so we can use all 4 tanks to take India back. So that's the trick. So the way industries work in this game, I think it's the same with every Axis Allies game now that I'm saying it, is the industry is viable for use by the power that controls the territory if they owned it at the beginning of their turn. And now, as you can already see, there's nothing the Germans can do to prevent the British from building like normal. And when the British start their second turn, they can just move right back in, right? They can move, and then if the Japanese didn't destroy the transport that was down in Australia, which they can do, right? They could destroy it, but then you're drawing off forces from any potential attack against the Americans. So you're really, I think it's just I don't know, it's fun to do. It's fun to do this as the British because it just really forces the Axis to make a ton of weird decisions. And there's more than once where I got a player who didn't realize what was going on. Why am I building an industry and then retreating? Well, the Russians have it covered down, and then I can plop, 3 infantry down on or 2 infantry in a tank, or whatever. I can just drop whatever else I want to on the next turn, right? So I could have when the Japanese ended their turn, they may have had 2 infantry in here, maybe more even. But by the time Britain's done with it on their second turn, they could have up to 6 infantry, a tank, a fighter, Russian tanks. You can turn this thing into a huge hub as the British very early on. Okay, so I don't know why I just did that, but okay, so then down here, Union of South Africa, this is to help fight the Germans. Obviously, this one has more of a risk of being overrun, but again, the theme here is to buy time. This is a 2 IPC value territory. We don't want the Germans to get this. We want to turn Kenya and Rhodesia into a dead zone, and we should be expecting reinforcements coming down in terms of the fighter push, right? So these fighters can kind of push the Indian fighter out as an option for defense down in the Union of South Africa. And that's pretty much it. So the short and mid game is really just massive investment in this containment strategy. You are, as the British player with this strategy, married to these industries, okay? If you do what my recommendation is, you're married to these industries, and what you're doing, it has a twofold benefit. One, you're preventing the Axis from rapid expansion. You're turning those attainable and sustainable territories into much less so, right? Because now the Allies have something to say about what's going on in the middle of the board more than they did before. And this actually benefits the Allied player who would need it the most. You're defending your own territories, in other words. You're maintaining your own IPCs longer, right? You're able to hold on to them longer. So that's my British strategy, and I don't know. That's just, I feel like it's a neat little trick you can play on the Japanese. If you are the Japanese player and somebody does that to you, do not. I just don't do it. I've had it done to me too, by somebody who liked it. That idea, I just, you know, ignore it. You'll contain it and deal with it later as the Japanese carry on against the Americans and the Russians, and ignore the British industry for the time being. So, or at least on the turn one, I should say. Don't fall for the little trap there. Thanks for watching this. All the best from the good captain, and bye-bye.